So we've gone virtually live. Orbrix used to do very much face-to-face training, and now we've gone virtually online due to the crisis that we are in. And of course, you'll learn more about how to manage that particular crisis here today. So for me, more importantly, I strongly believe that we cannot become ourselves by ourselves. And through all of that you see on the screen, what I've learned is to become consciously purposeful in our lives as a leader. And I think during this time of COVID, it is all about how purposeful have we become in our business, in our lives, in what we do. And I think most of you on the session here today are involved in restoring our world in some way or the other, and therefore you're attending this particular session here today. So just a little bit about Orbrix. Orbrix is based here in the UAE. We specialize in a few academies, and one particular academy that we do specialize in is the CBRN Academy, out of which this series that you are listening to today falls under. We have been running some programs, live, face-to-face, and now, as you can see, we're running a lot of them here through the virtual academy. We also run a lot of radiation protection officer training, and we're one of the centers that have started right from about March to run them virtually live, where you are still able to receive your CME points and get your points across, so that you are able to still function with the license. Armel, are we all good? I hear some background noise.
Everything fine.
Okay, good. Thank you. Okay, good. And also, as you can see, we do have many other academies. We have the Business Academy, Leadership Academy, Human Resources, Health and Safety. We have our online services. And then, of course, we also do a lot of coaching and mentoring. So please feel free to watch for us on Facebook, watch for us on our website, so that you are able to connect with us in terms of the needs that you have. And remember, a lot of those leadership programs, Human Resources, is specifically inclined to the industry that you are in. So if you are in the oil and gas sector, then we have a leadership program specifically inclined for you. We would also look at your health and safety, and we would customize the programs. So the one thing that Orbrix strives on is to be able to customize specific programs for you. And so please feel free to follow us on our Facebook, on our LinkedIn, and also importantly on our website, so that you can get more information on that. So coming to the virtually live, we've decided as of March that because we can't have the face-to-face training, we've decided to have lots of virtual workshops, out of which this one is one of them, where we have a few complimentary workshops, and we're glad that you all could join us here today. We have virtual panel discussions, which takes place every Saturday. In fact, this week Saturday is one of our last ones for the month of May. We'll be running and talking about specific how do you manage leadership within COVID-19 current and post. And then, of course, please watch out for our global summit, which will be coming out in the first to second week of June. The dates should be confirmed in this week. We will be talking specifically about CBRN. We'll be having a summit, and we're going to talk about the lessons learned during COVID-19 from various countries, various regions, and you're going to listen to it directly by the experts who's been involved in the restoration of the various areas in their countries as well. So please watch out for that global summit that is going to be taking place shortly. Just some housekeeping, ladies and gents, before I hand over to our presenter, Dr. Jeff, is if you wish to toggle your video on and off, please feel free to do so, especially if you would like to talk directly to the presenter and if you have a question. Also, you have a mute and an unmute button. If you would like to chat, please feel free to unmute yourself. I know that Armel might have unmuted some of you at the moment. If there is any background sound, please, if you have unmuted, just check your background sound. Or alternatively, you're more than welcome to also chat to us in the chat box, as you can see there at the bottom. Both Armel and I, who are basically working in the background as our presenter speaks, will watch out for your chats, and we will also take forward all your questions that you might have. Alternatively, please feel free to ask those questions live. You have the presenter in front of you. Nothing stops you from raising your hand. We will unmute you, and you can then directly ask your question to your presenter as we move along. And most importantly, let's also have some fun while we're having the session. So, you know, the more interactive it is, the more fun we will be having during this particular session as well. So to introduce you to our speaker for today, we have Dr. Jeff. He has a PhD in nuclear engineering and is a certified professional engineer. He has 37 years of experience, which includes 13 as a naval officer. He worked in over 20 countries, and I think that's, for me, is what was really stood out when Jeff and I connected about almost more than a year ago, and we started working together in terms of putting together various programs specifically for the CBRN here in the UAE, which we will be rolling out. So please watch out for those programs that will be presented by Jeff together with some of his colleagues, even from Canada, that will be presenting on various programs. So without further ado, Jeff, all over to you as the presenter. I'll be handing over presentation mode to you now shortly as well. Just to confirm while I'm doing that everyone else can hear and they are able to see the screen. Jeff, all yours.
Thank you. Can you actually let me share my screen, please, Hawa?
Sure, will do. Over to you, Jeff.
Let's see if that works, and it should. All good?
All good.
All right, fantastic. Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm assuming it's morning for everyone, mostly, or close. I'm so happy to see that so many people have joined, and well, I'll try to make it interesting for you. But we're going to talk about crisis management a little bit this morning, and we are in a crisis right now. We all are. It's a global crisis. It's around the world. It's everywhere. We don't have a choice. We are faced with it. And it's interesting to see that there's so many different reactions in how to manage this crisis from different points of view, different countries, different cultures, different environments. So what I'd like to do is share with you a little bit of my experience in those 20 plus countries where I have worked with crisis management organizations, on what I've seen that works and what I've seen that doesn't work, and some of the common points, some of the common threads that I've seen around the world, regardless of culture, regardless of language, regardless of race. So that's what we're going to be talking about this morning for a little bit less than an hour. Hopefully we'll be doing that in less than an hour. What I'd like to ask you, if you have any questions, please raise your hand. Either ask the question on the chat, which I have in front of me, or if you want, please unmute yourself and ask the question at any point. I'll be asking questions from time to time, and hopefully we'll have a as good an interactive session as we can, given the fact that we're speaking on the web. So let me start by saying, first of all, that the reason we talk about crisis management is because we cannot always control events. But if we have effective crisis management systems, if we have effective crisis management practices, we can manage at least the impact of these events. And this is nothing is more true than what we're looking at right now in terms of the COVID-19 emergency and crisis around the world. Depending on how we manage that crisis, we can actually turn it into a severe crisis or something that is actually completely manageable. So a little bit about me. Hawa has told you a little bit about me. I'm not going to say too much more. I think the key here is that I've worked in over 20 different countries around the world, and that gives you a bit of an insight on what works, what doesn't work. And sometimes I might be wrong. Sometimes I might be right. Some of you may have slightly different experience than I do. But, you know, together we can share knowledge, we can share practices, we can share what we understand about what makes crisis management good or what makes crisis management inefficient. This is not a complete course. This is not a certificate course. This is just an introduction to what crisis management is all about. There is a longer course. It's only 4 hours, but we cover a lot more, and I'll be discussing that later on in this at the end of this this very small module. And we do have a suite of other courses that cover CBRN, crisis management, disaster management, nuclear emergency, radiological emergency response. This is maybe just a bit of an appetizer for these other courses. In this seminar, what we'll be covering is some definitions to make sure we all understand the same thing the same way. I want to provide some examples of some of the crises and try to analyze what do they have in common, even though you'll see they're quite different. And we'll talk a little bit about the anatomy of a crisis. Some of you will be completely familiar with that, especially if you've been managing human relief or disaster relief in different countries. You'll know exactly what I'm talking about. And then I want to take you through what I consider to be the top 10 issues and mistakes that are made commonly in crisis management. And then I'll introduce you to what the next course is all about. This is probably not for me, but if it's for me, I'm busy, okay?
Naka-online class ako.
What is a crisis?
Sige, tawag ako ulit tayo.
What is a crisis? I think we have someone on the phone right now. That's great. I didn't understand the thing, but that's all right. What is a crisis? If you look at the definition of a crisis, it's essentially it's a difficult and dangerous time in which a solution is needed, and you need it quickly. If you talk about an emergency, you'll find the definition that is almost the same. It's an unexpected and dangerous situation. It happens suddenly, and it requires quick thinking and quick actions. So there's a lot of confusion as to what is the difference between a crisis and an emergency, and I don't want to debate that in this seminar. In my experience, we often refer to a crisis as an emergency that we were managing but lost control over. So a crisis is an emergency that just went out of control, and now we're having trouble struggling to get back into the right track, trying to manage the situation. Crisis, emergency, not very different. And for those of you who have a certain age, maybe like me, you'll recognize the album on the right by Supertramp, Crisis, White Crisis. Yeah, sometimes that's a question. Is it a crisis or is it not a crisis? I want to take you through some of these examples, and you'll see here that they are quite different. There are 9 there. Look at Bhopal, 1984. That happened very quickly. There was a chemical explosion. 4,000 people, more than 4,000 people died. A little over 500,000 injuries. Happened in 1984. It was a fairly quick event. The impacts were fairly medium term, but a lot of people died, and very quickly. If you look at Chernobyl, I'm sure that everyone is familiar with this one. You'll note that there are 32 direct deaths from the Chernobyl accident. Now, a lot of people will tell you that there were millions and millions from the radiological impacts. Well, it's a question for debate. The fact is that there are 32 people that died from radiation injuries in that 1986 event. A lot of other people died or will die from the indirect impacts of radiation. Maybe not as many as we think, but that's a question that's being debated by many different organizations. But the key here is 32 direct deaths, an unknown number of indirect deaths that have occurred and will occur in the future, and a very, very large environmental damage, including a zone that 30 kilometers that's still uninhabited. 9/11, very different. 3,000 people, give or take, died directly from the impact. 6,000 were injured. The cost was amazing, but one of the greater impacts, and I think we're suffering from that impact today, is a loss of trust and the installation in fear. Fear that has actually changed the way we travel. Fear that has changed the way that we go to a country or another. If you're a frequent traveler at the airport, you've seen the impact of 9/11, and it is a major disruption, but it's not a direct one, it's an indirect disruption. Look at this one. This is one person. Litvinenko in 2006 died from polonium poisoning of causes that we will not discuss. There was one death, but there was an international crisis. Why? Because that little bit of polonium being dragged through airplanes, restaurants, toilets, bars, caused international concern. A lot of people traveling through London back to their countries thought, you know what, I might have been contaminated. I was on that plane. So the crisis, only one person died, but the impact was international, and we clearly had an international crisis. Some of you may have been involved in management of this. You'll recall that there were hundreds, if not thousands, of calls on the hotlines trying to figure out, am I impacted by this contamination? Here's a totally different one. Stock market, 2008. No one died, not directly anyway. No one died from the stock market crash, but there was a massive, massive financial impact. And one might argue that some people may have died from the hardship, the financial hardship that resulted from this. Another crisis, but you see so far completely different. You know this one, the deep water horizon oil spill in 2010 in the Gulf of Mexico. No direct deaths, but again, large environmental damage, large economic damage, especially in the food industry in the region. And it took a long, long time to actually get this incident under control. This one is an interesting one. That was the Iceland volcano that erupted in 2010, spewing a lot of smoke and ashes in the air. There were no direct deaths from that. Again, direct deaths. There may have been indirect deaths from the deposition of the particles, but no direct deaths from this incident. But the impact on air travel. Some of you in Europe may recall you may have been stuck in the country where you were. A lot of my colleagues were in Spain, for example, trying to go back to Netherlands, could not. All flights were canceled. Nothing was flying following this. Who doesn't know this one? Fukushima, 2011. 2,000 plus disaster-related deaths. Oh, by the way, disaster-related means that it was really a result of the tsunami, not so much the radiation. Radiation, in fact, didn't kill anyone, not directly anyway. But the impact on the environment was large, and the impact on the international trade was enormous. And welcome to this beautiful one that we're currently living through. The coronavirus, 2019, 2020, ... Is it over? We don't know. Long crisis, long emergency. Initially, we didn't think it'd be a crisis, but as of 10 May 2020, that is yesterday, we had over or almost 280,000 deaths, and we're still counting. So these are very, very different types of emergencies and crises. You notice I use the word emergencies and crises in this case because some of those may have been more difficult to control than others. But the fact is that they all are very different, but they're all emergencies and crises. So, you know, if you have any idea, please write it down on the chat. What is the commonality between these various events? Is it number of people dead? Is it the number of the number of days that it lasted? What is it about it? Think about it. Write it down if you want to. We're going to move on to that anyway. But what does define a crisis? What is it? Let's start by saying what it's not, shall we? It is not defined by number of casualties. We have one that had only absolutely disruption of daily living. That is one of the factors. It's one of the impacts. We'll see that in a minute, but that's a good point. So it's not the number of casualties. It's not the duration. We had some like Bhopal that actually lasted a very short time. It was over quickly, but the impact lingered on for a long time. These are all like, they're not all crises. Absolutely. They're emergencies and crises. The difference between an emergency and a crisis, as I said before, is a very, very fine line. And it may have to do with the ability to control what you're dealing with. And it's also not defined by the source. Is it natural, industrial, or terrorist? We have crises or emergencies that I described that were caused by natural disasters. Some of them were industrial accidents, and some of them were terrorist events. So that's not what defines a crisis or an emergency, for that matter. It is defined, on the other hand, by the ability to control and the need for complex decisions. So an emergency and a crisis are not things that are easy to control, easy to manage, and they usually require very complex decisions, not easy ones to make. It's defined by escalation. It starts sometimes quite slowly and it escalates a lot. It may start with a big bang, in which case you're dealing with something that doesn't escalate so much. But yes, stressful time, Angela. Absolutely. It is extremely stressful. And although we're not going to cover it too much in this course, in the 4-hour introductory course to crisis management, we talk about the impact on the stress impact on the ability to make decisions and how we can deal with it. And it's also defined by the risk, not necessarily the real risk, but it can be the perceived risk. Think about COVID-19. Think about it. A lot of controversy as to whether or not we overreacted. Did we react because the risk was real? Or did politicians react because of the perceived risk by the population and the need to be seen to do something? Good question. I'm not going to try to answer it now, but think about it. Real versus perceived risk is what might be driving decision making. And that's something we'll talk about later. But what's important to understand is that in all cases, whether it's a crisis or an emergency, the impacts that we're looking at and the magnitude of the impacts we're looking at can be social, it can be related to health, it can be political, it can be financial or environmental. It doesn't have to be number of people that die. It can be disruption in life, as Angela said. It can be the health impact as we have now in COVID, but it can also be political. If a party, if a government is about to fall as a result of the situation, that can be a crisis, and that has to be managed. So a crisis is something that is varied, complex, and difficult to manage. I want to look at two examples in more detail, and you'll see they're very different. One is Fukushima, radiological incident, nuclear accident, and the other one is a COVID-19 emergency. In both cases, number of deaths was quite high, but they are, I think you will admit, quite different. So let's look at them, but not in great detail, just a little bit. Now, I want to bring your attention to a couple of things that are maybe interesting. 11th of March 2001, there was an earthquake in Japan, off the coast of Japan, and it was at 1446, and all reactors shut down. That's what they do. The nuclear power plants are designed with safety systems that actually shut down reactors when there's an earthquake of a certain magnitude. Done. That's great. However, a little less than an hour later, there was a second tsunami flood and a wave, and that wave actually went over the dikes, went over the walls. It was a little bit higher than what they had anticipated. Bit of a story behind that. They had realized that there could potentially, hypothetically, be a wave that is higher than the dike, and they were in the process of seeking approval for modifications to the dike system from the regulatory organization. They had realized that could happen, but they hadn't made the changes yet. And that wave just went over the dike. When it went over the dike, that was it. You flood the site. The problem is that when you flood the site, given the position of the emergency diesels, you flood the diesels, they can't work. The batteries are flooded, they can't work either. So they had a total blackout. No power from outside, no power from within. The reactors shut down. They are in a blackout situation. But look at this one, 1645. That was about an hour later. That's when they reported nuclear event. 1903. Now we are, what, 4 hours, almost 4 hours after the initial event, they declare a nuclear emergency. At 2050, so that's 10 minutes to 9 p.m., there was an order to evacuate the Fukushima by the Fukushima prefecture. That is the province, essentially. It was 2 kilometers around the plant. At what, 20 minutes later, half an hour later, another evacuation order, this time by the national government, for 3 kilometers around the plant. Look at these two things here. This is interesting. Within half an hour, 2 orders to evacuate. One says 2 kilometers, the other one says 3 kilometers. I want you to think about what you think when you are a member of the public and you get these 2 different orders within half an hour. Not very different, but just different enough to be rather confusing, isn't it? Something to think about. The next day, the operations center became operational, and at 5:44 in the next morning, evacuation order of 10 kilometers was ordered around the plant. And then there was that explosion that everybody saw. And then in the evening, another evacuation order to 20 kilometers around the plant. That's day 2. Day 3, there was a formal report of a nuclear emergency. Day 4, there was another explosion, this time at Unit 3. There were 4 units on the site. Then day 5, the government response is established. And then another explosion, Unit 4. And then another order to shelter, but 20 to 30 kilometers from the plant. And then they realized, hey, we have high radiation dose rates at 20 kilometers from the plant. What do we do? Then there were decisions to restrict water. Then the government started issuing food restriction. That lasted a long time. Look at that, several weeks after this. The key here is that the decision on whether or not we should evacuate beyond 20 kilometers was determined on the 17th of April. When is that? That's over a month after the incident. The criteria for reopening school were only established a week later. This is interesting, and I'll come back to that. Keep that in mind. What were the major challenges in Fukushima? Some of them. There are many challenges, and I'm sure some of you have seen different ones. But look at some of the key ones. Early on, this was an unanticipated severity and complexity. No one thought that could happen. Well, actually, some did, but the changes were not made in time to actually be effective against this kind of a situation. So this was something that they hadn't really planned for. It was extremely high in terms of confusion. They didn't know what was going on. Communication systems were broken down. The assessment was wrong. They didn't know what was going on inside the reactor. They didn't know what was going on outside the reactor. They needed to make decisions quickly. And that was a key. And that's a key. And we'll come back to that. And then, of course, because it was a major disaster, natural disaster, combined with a high-tech or industrial accident, the disruption to the basic infrastructure was huge. It was massive, and this is something that was actually impeding the response to the event. In the medium term, the focus changed a little bit. The problem was the number of organizations that needed to be managed and that needed to work together. There was a lot of them, and communications coordination between these organizations was not always very effective. The data on contamination was very confusing. I'll show you a little bit later, but you'll see that they didn't really know what was going on in terms of impact. So how do you make decisions when you don't really have a good operational situational awareness? The large-scale measures that needed to be implemented were well beyond the resources that they had. Kudos to the resources and the individuals and the people of Japan. Everybody pitched in. There were people that actually devoted themselves, a little bit like we see now with the healthcare workers and COVID-19. When the time comes, people respond, and that was great, but the resources were not up to the task. And one of the big ones, this one, it was very difficult for the Japanese authorities to explain what was going on to the media. They try to be too fancy, they try to be too complicated, they try to be too detailed, and they really hadn't thought about how to do that beforehand. So when the time came, the confusion was enormous. Press communiques, press releases tended to be 4, 5, 6 pages. It was really half a page of information. The rest was explanation of what the information really meant. In the long term, what we have is, and you'll see that again and again, long term is challenge is how do we go back to normal? What are the criteria? When do we decide we can let people go home? When do we decide we need to decontaminate? These are things that need to be discussed beforehand, but it's a major challenge because most of the time they're not. So let's look at some of the shortcomings. Decision making was in Tokyo. That is the way it was done. That delayed the decision-making process, and it caused some of the consequences that we've seen. They decided to rely on predictive models, and this is a big thing. Some of you may be involved in more technical emergencies, or even COVID-19. Now we're trying to predict what was going to happen. I want to show you something. This is what they thought was going to happen according to the models. This is what actually happened in terms of contamination. You see here, we've got contamination going southwest. The actual contamination was actually mainly in the northwest direction, with a little bit here. That's it. So that actually caused confusion, and in some cases, wrong decisions to be made. They delayed the initial evacuations because they didn't know what's going on. They decided to evacuate hospitals that didn't need to be evacuated. A lot of people were sick in there, very elderly patients, and they ended up dying not because of the impact of the radiation, but they ended up dying because the evacuation was not properly planned and they were not properly moved. There was a lack of coordination between the local and the national authorities. That's what I mentioned about the 2 and the 3 kilometer evacuation orders. When you have confusion from the authorities and you tell people what to do and it's not the same, you are making an emergency a crisis. You're turning something that could be managed into something that could become unmanageable. The instructions for evacuation kept changing. They didn't know what they were doing, so they kept contradicting each other and they kept expanding, retracting. So that is something that needs that can lead to crisis. Communication of instructors was impaired, so that was a bit of a problem. They had no way to communicate these instructions to the public, and as a result, the media communication became very complex, as I mentioned. So that's Fukushima. nuclear disaster. And let's look at something that's completely different. There's nothing nuclear about this one. It's all about biological. And here we have an act that is an accident. It's a pandemic. Never mind the conspiracy theories that said that this was created. We're not going to get into that. That's not the issue. But we now, up to now, have about 280,000 deaths around the world. And what's really interesting is that this whole thing happened. If you look at it, it happened somewhere around the end of February. We knew, and the Chinese knew well before that, but we knew everywhere in the world around this time that something was going on. Do you remember what happened? Do you remember what people said? Do you remember the countries that said, well, you know what? It's not going to come here. We have good protection. We're not going to let it in. Do you remember the countries that said, you know what? Let it come and let the community immunity take care of this one? Well, we had a bit of a surprise on this one. Things didn't quite go the way we thought. This is what happened. I'm showing you China, Italy, France, Austria, USA, and WHO, the World Health Organization. It's just to illustrate a little bit the differences in the way that things happen and the response between those various entities. It is by no means the full picture, but it's a bit of a picture. So in January, the first, actually at the end of December, the first patient was picked up in China. They knew it was a new coronavirus. The world was informed, and the first step occurred in January on the 11th. It took 13 days for them to say we're locking down Wuhan. So they locked down on 23 Jan and they reopened on 7 April. China ends Wuhan lockdown 7 April. Now, in Italy, the first case was picked up at the end of January. And a few days later, they said, that's it, we're locking it down. Because someone died, they said, we're locking down Lombardy. That was just in time because it actually went like wildfire in Italy, if you recall that correctly. And there was a national lockdown just a few more days later on the 11th of March, and the whole of the whole country. So the whole country of Italy was locked down. Now compare that to France. The first that happened in 14 January of this year. It was a Chinese individual who was returning to France. It was de-amplified. It was okay, that's it. It's not one of ours. It's came from there. It probably doesn't affect us. But look at what happened in between. That was about 3 months later, January to March, that on 17th March, the order was given to lockdown. Actually, the order was given on the 16th of March. I was in Pakistan at the time, and I had about 24 hours to make it back to France. At noon on the 17th, France locked down, shut the borders, and everybody had to stay indoors. Austria had a very different approach. First case was on 25 Feb. And they started closing down their borders on the 10th of March. They went to full lockdown on the 15th. So they reacted very, very quickly in Austria. And I think if you look at the WHO statistics for the COVID in Austria, you'll find that it is a model pandemic case of a downwards curve. It's been managed very effectively, and they've reopened on the 14th of April. By the way, in France, we are reopening today. Reopening in a very gradual way. So you see, we've been locked down for 2 months. In the US, that was an interesting case, and that one is actually still not going down. It's not coming down. First death was on the 29th of February, and 8 states in the US locked down on the 8th of March, but not the federal government. The federal government didn't issue any sort of a order until the 13th of March, where they finally declared this a national emergency. And if you look at the news now, you'll see that there's a lot of differences between the various states on how they are reopening or not reopening. WHO picked this up a long time ago on 30th of Jan. They said that was a global health emergency. A lot of people said, why don't you call that an epidemic or a pandemic? They said, no, it doesn't meet the criteria yet. It was only on the 11th of March that this was declared a pandemic. Look at the timeline. It's quite different, actually. We have fairly long lockdown, fairly quick reaction. This one is quick. Austria went very, very quickly, and therefore was the first one to deconfine. I'm not even talking about Sweden. That's a different story. And WHO actually tried to do their job, but there was some people say it was maybe a little bit slow in responding. They did respond. They did have very good instructions before that, but everybody was a little bit different. And this one, you've been watching it. It's always an interesting one to see. The differences were massive. We had some countries saying we're going to go for total lockdown, confinement, as we call it in France. That a good example of that is France, UK. UK went that way, but not before. Not before it was actually alerted by the medical community there that something bad was going to happen. And of course, as we all know, Boris Johnson got sick, and that actually reinforced the need for confinement. And Dubai is another one. We had examples where there was essentially no lockdown. Brazil is one that is a bit controversial at the moment. We've got Bolsonaro saying, no, we're going to continue doing business. His Minister of Health, or his previous or his prior Minister of Health, who's since been fired, said, no, we need to confine. Sweden said, well, we did confine, but only the schools. Sweden's closed the schools. And I think you can see right now, if you go look at the statistics for Sweden, I think you'll see that Sweden, of all the Nordic countries, is the one that has the worst impact from the COVID-19. In fact, if you look at number of cases, number of deaths in Sweden, it's probably about 10 times more than you have in, say, Finland, Norway, or Denmark. There was another difference in responses. You wear a mask or don't you? In China, they said you're silly if you don't. In France, they're saying, well, you don't really need to, because if you don't wear them properly, they're not going to be that useful. Now they've adopted a more gradual, graded approach. We say if you take public transport, or if you can't stay more than 1 meter from the individuals around you, then yeah, please wear the mask. But other than that, it's not necessary. So it's not clear. Do you need masks? Do you not need masks? The other one that actually is super, super important is this one. That is the detection. In some cases, as in Germany, lots of testing. It was general. Everybody got tested. It was random testing, and they ended up picking up a lot of cases this way. Statistics reflect the number of tests, not so much the number of cases, interestingly enough. Whereas in France, for example, they said, no, we're only going to test those people that we think may be affected. So until you show the symptoms, you're not really tested, unless you are the mayor of a small town, or if you are a member of the health care community. But other than that, unless you show signs, you're not tested. So obviously, the number of people that get sick compared to the number of people that are tested will be higher in France and Germany, because in Germany, they tested everyone. And then the treatment, that was subject to availability of equipment. In some countries, they had lots of equipment. In some, they didn't have anything. And in some cases, they had to invoke something called the Defense Production Act to ask some industries to actually shift their production from something they were doing before, shoes, underwear, to something that we needed, masks. In the case of the airline industry, aircraft manufacturers, they switched to making ventilators. But the key here is this one. There's not one solution that works for everyone. It depends on the situation, depends on the country, depends on the context, and depends on the culture. This is not an easy thing. So what were the challenges? And now I'd like to ask you to recall what we read, what we did when we were talking about Fukushima. Early challenges in the COVID-19. Unanticipated severity and complexity. Same. Extremely high level of confusion. What's going on? How many cases? Is it, what's the multiplication factor? What's the death rate? Is it more than the flu? Is it less than the flu? It was extremely confusing. And the message also, if you recall, the message to us, the population, was very confusing. Quick decision making was needed. In some cases, people say it was a bit of a knee-jerk reaction. That is a reaction without thinking. In some cases, some people say it wasn't quick enough, and major disruption to normal life. I think we all experience it. No one is an exception here. I think there may have been 8 countries that were not affected that way. Some of us are going back to more or less normal life, but not many. In medium term, there was a problem with the equipment and the logistics, but the big one, that was a big one, and is still the one that is actually motivating our decision to deconfine. What is the economic impact of this crisis? Is the economic impact and its long-term consequence on health worse than the virus itself? That's an interesting question, isn't it? Are we doing what we're doing? Is it really protecting life in the short term, or is it putting people in danger in the long term because of the economic impact? That is one of the dilemmas that crisis managers have to make. Are we overreacting? Are we underreacting? And I think you've seen it more and more, this public fatigue. This is going on for a month, 2 months in some cases. There's no enforcement possible. In many states in the US, they said, the hell with this, we've had it, we're done. We're free, we're gonna do what we want, and we will actually expose ourselves to the risk. That's the way it's going to be. In the long term, the same as in Fukushima, we return to normal. What are the criteria? It's the same question we're asking now. What are the criteria for returning to normal, what we call the new normal? And how are we going to financially recover from this emergency? So again, what do Fukushima and the coronavirus have in common? Think about it, but I think you've seen it already. There are differences. Fukushima was a few days, but the years will be, the years of impact will be very, very long. In the case of Corona, this is something that goes on for months. What are the measures to be taken? Let me see, I missed that question. Looks like an interesting one. What are the measures to be taken in African countries to face efficiently the COVID-19 damage? Good question. Let's see if I can maybe give you a bit of an answer without responding to the whole thing. I'm not a medical doctor. A medical doctor might tell you, might give you a better answer than me, but it's obvious now that what we are encountering is that the key factor in managing this emergency is detection, isolation. And the reason why it's had such impacts in some countries and less in others is because of the amount of testing and the promptness with which we are able to identify cases of COVID. So early detection is absolutely, Mark, absolutely. Early detection is the key to managing this event. Now people realize it, they knew that, and prompt treatment. Of course, prompt treatment. Once you isolate, of course, you don't just put them in the hut and leave them there, but we do have to treat them. There's also some controversy about what treatment is effective and what isn't. And if some of you follow the French politics, you'll find out that there's a lot of doctors say we should do something. Some doctors say, no, we shouldn't do it. It's not clear yet, and I'm not going to get into that. But early detection is the key. So in Africa and elsewhere, it is the key. Isolation, social distancing is what you do to prevent once it is in the population, you want to minimize the spread of it. You want to minimize contagion. But ideally, if you have a good detection program and you have good social distancing and good social precautions, you will be able to manage this. So African countries, the same as any other country, that's the key. Let's go back to Fukushima and Corona. The impact in the case of Fukushima was mainly national, but there were a lot of indirect international impacts, but not direct international impact. It wasn't Corona, it was international. But if you look at the challenges, it's the same. Unanticipated severity and complexity, confusion and unknown, need for quick reaction. The data was confusing. In the case of Fukushima, we talk about contamination. In the case of the coronavirus, we talk about contagion. Same thing. Large-scale measures that exceed available resources. We saw that in Fukushima. They didn't have what they needed to respond. And Corona, the COVID, same thing. The big thing was masks and respirators. By the way, gloves, forget it. It's not that useful if you don't wash them just the same way you should do the hands. So it's masks and the ventilators. And still to this day, and the number of tests kits. So even now, countries are not meeting the test targets that they have imposed on themselves. Explaining that to the media, in both cases, that was a challenge. And criteria for further action or termination. When do we terminate these measures? So in both cases, the shortcomings were very similar. Too little or too late or too much. What is the right measure of actions to take? What is the impact now versus the impact long-term? Confusing instructions. We're still getting those confusing instructions. Even to this day, I'm not actually getting a clear picture as to where certain things have to be done and others not. Communicating that decision to the public. In both cases, that was a bit of a mess. By the way, it's one of the most challenging things to do, tasks to achieve during a crisis is communicating to the public. One might say that if you communicate well to the public, you are much better able to manage your crisis. But if your communication is not good, you may have something that is quite simple turn into a major crisis. And the big thing, no clear plan for ending the crisis return to normal. Nobody thought of it. So we're having to make up the criteria as we go. It's not obvious what it is we have to do. So let's look at the anatomy of a crisis. In all cases, in the early phase, what I call the early phase after the detection. How long is that early phase? Hours, 2 weeks. You don't have much time to think about what to do. You need to have in place reflex actions. So crisis management relies very much on reflex actions in the first few hours, the first few days, the first few weeks. It depends on the crisis. In the second phase, the intermediate phase, which by the way may last days all the way to months, now we have time to analyze. We have time to consult, and we need to. So a good crisis manager at that point analyzes the situation, consults with the main stakeholders, not just the authorities, but the stakeholders, the people that actually have a stake in the issue at hand. They do a cost-benefit analysis and they manage dilemmas. So managing dilemmas in the crisis is key. And sometimes they have to take actions and decisions that are trade-offs. The late phase can last months to several years. Fukushima, Chernobyl, we're still very much into the late phase and the recovery actions. So in the late phase, we're looking at managing recovery. We're looking at major consultation between the various stakeholders. As an example, you may ask people to go back to their house, but they may not want to because their house was contaminated by chemical or radiological or other agents. You may need to consult with them. You may need to have some financial payments. You may need to invoke the insurance clauses. So there's a lot of negotiation going on, and then you're into the financial assistance domain. So let's look at the top 10 mistakes in crisis management based on what I've discussed. Excuse me. And we'll go through that fairly quickly because you'll recognize some of them. Those are my mistakes, the ones that I identified. There are many, many more. And some of you may disagree with some of those, but that's okay. I'm giving you what I think are top 10 on my list of things that I have seen wrong. The first one is not knowing when the emergency. The most recent event is the same thing, COVID-19. A lot of countries initially said, that's not an emergency, we're fine. Later on, they said, yeah, it is an emergency. So not knowing when you need to trigger. If you trigger too early, there are some impacts. If you trigger too late, there are some impacts. They're not the same, but you have to really decide when's the right time to say, yes, we have an emergency. Number two is unclear roles. I love this one because when you have poor planning in your national authorities, local authorities, you're going to run into this. Oh, I thought it was you doing this. No, I thought it was you doing this. In the end, it doesn't get done. In the end, no one claims responsibility, and you have holes in your response. That's a key one. The third one is no or delayed decision making. So I've seen some countries, and I will not mention which ones, where crisis management meetings would take 4, 5, 6 hours sometimes. At the end of which, when you went around and tried to analyze what decision have you made, there were no decisions made. Why? Because in some countries, coordination and agreement is really important, and no one was able to actually take the leadership and say, we'll make that decision. So no or delayed decision making is a key issue in crisis management. The other one is knee jerking. Knee jerking is something that I've talked about before. Essentially, it means you're making a decision just to make a decision without thinking of the impact. So you do something because you want to be seen as doing something, but in the end, it may not be the right decision, and that is not a good practice in crisis management. Number 5, making decisions based on perceived risk. We call it media management or managing by media. That is the wrong way of doing it. You've heard a lot of people say in COVID-19, we're going to make decisions based on science. That is the right way to do it. But at the same time, some politicians are swayed by the way the public reacts, either through the media or through other social media means. And some decisions might actually be the result of political pressure or social pressure rather than science. Number 6, Reactive response, you do something quickly, you don't think about the long-term impacts. One might say that this is the major dilemma that we have with COVID-19 now. It's a big one. The fact of sheltering everyone, locking down the countries, had a major impact on the financial market. It had a major impact on the economic aspects and viability of that country. Is it that at some point we'll find that maybe that economic impact is greater in terms of long-term effects than the impact of the COVID-19? I don't know. It's a good question. Is it reactive? Was it strategic? It's not always clear. Number 7, communications and common situational awareness. It is always an issue in all the crises and all the emergencies I've seen, where you have various organizations working. They work on different timelines, and sometimes they don't have the same operational situational awareness. If you don't all have the same picture of what's going on, think of a forest fire. If not all the organizations that are involved in forest fire know what's going on, where it's happening, they might make decisions that actually annihilate the actions of others, or to reduce the effectiveness of the overall emergency management system. Number 8, not taking into account the media. I said before that it's dangerous if you manage an emergency by what the media says, but it's also dangerous if you don't take it into account. For example, if you decide to make decisions and do not properly get the media on board, rather than working with the media, you start working against the media. I always say the media is your friend. Treat it as one of the tools that you have in your toolbox for crisis management. It is not the enemy. And I'm sure you wouldn't be surprised, but there are many countries, including some of the ones where you come from, where people say the media has to be managed. No, I say the media has to be coordinated with. You can't manage the media. They will do whatever they want. And if you try to control them, they will probably do something that is not what you want them to do. Number 9, not following established procedures. Why? Mainly because either they don't exist, or they have not been well communicated to all the response organizations, or the response organization never used them before, so they don't know them. And that leads me to number 10, which is lack of exercises. If you never, and no established procedures, Mark said, if you don't have procedures, you can't follow them. But if you never exercise this, if you never exercise emergency and crisis management, then there's a good chance when there's really one, you're going to be stuck in a position where you don't know exactly what to do. And what you do might actually lead to confusion rather than a focused response. I have seen countries, again, not to be mentioned, where people who have not received training in the emergency management protocol, in the crisis management protocol, are not allowed in the crisis management center, the emergency operations center, including ministers. Well, there's at least one country where people have said, if you are not trained, you're not coming in. And I don't care if you're the minister. That's interesting, because that leads to a situation where you need to take part in the exercises. You need to practice your procedures. And when you practice procedures, you identify shortcomings. So that's the bottom line. What works in emergency management? What in crisis management? What are the things that make it manageable? Well, you have to realize that it's not exactly like managing normal situations. In fact, and this is something that a lot of organizations need to come to grip with, is that a really good administrator, a really good manager, is not necessarily a really good crisis manager. Sometimes the best crisis manager is someone who's at a slightly lower level in the organization. That is a tough one, because if you're a crisis manager and your boss in normal time works for you during a crisis, it is difficult to make decisions that might go against the opinion of that boss, and you might fear that when you return to a normal situation, your boss might be resentful. So this is something that a lot of organizations have to struggle with. How do you identify and train the best crisis managers in the organization? Not easy. The normal rhythm in an emergency is broken. It's not like your normal administrative cycle. It's a business cycle that is related to emergency management. We call it an operational cycle. Decisions have to be made quickly, and they will have a major impact, much bigger than anything you might do in peacetime or in normal operations. In an emergency, you make the wrong decision, you can very quickly lose trust and credibility. Once you've done that, it's very difficult to recover it. And I'm sure a lot of you have seen that in a number of events. And chaos management is the rule. In an emergency, in a crisis, you imagine chaos. It's a precarious equilibrium. You have to constantly keep it balanced, but it's not always easy. And you're always going to be under the scrutiny of the media and public. So you have to recognize that in all of the actions that you take. This brings me to one of the last points in this presentation. I call it the risk matrix, the crisis risk matrix. Fact is that when you make decisions in a crisis, that decision will have a benefit. It has a positive impact. That's why you're making that decision. But every decision has a cost or a detriment. And you know, ideally, you want to be here. You want high benefit, low cost. That's where you want to be. You don't want to be there because a low benefit, high cost is not very good. Example, if you're evacuating 200,000 people from a zone that is not contaminated, the benefit is zero. The cost is super high in terms of money, but also in terms of health. So we don't want to be there. However, in practice, this is where we end up, always somewhere in the middle. And this is what I call dilemma management. You have to now manage decisions that are manage situations, manage events in a way that there's a cost, but there's a benefit. So how do you maximize the cost or the benefit cost ratio? How do you maximize this? That's dilemma management, which we cover in a different course in detail. So let me summarize, and we're going to come to the end of this one. Crises are complex and confusing. What's important is what is the impact, but the impact can be in terms of social, health, political, financial terms. It doesn't have to be necessarily in terms of health. Decisions have to be made quickly, and they have to be made, unfortunately, when you don't know much about the emergency. You have to make those decisions before you understand everything. And finally, crisis management relies on a dynamic risk assessment. You're constantly looking at what is the risk of doing something versus not doing anything, and it always will involve trade-offs. So those are the 3 points. If you remember anything from this seminar, remember this, because that, as a crisis manager yourself, these are things that you're going to have to deal with all the time. Now, if you were to take the 4-hour course, it's not that long, but we cover into more detail some of these aspects. For example, we review what is a crisis. We looked at it now. We don't need to go into deep on this one since we've already seen it. But then we'll look more at the types of crisis and emergency, and we cover maybe a little bit more about the CBRN in this one, when we discuss the impacts, the probability, what could happen, what are some of the scenarios that we deal with, and how could they happen. We then cover things that the differences between accidents, events, if you wish, and terrorist events. What is the difference between something that happened that wasn't supposed to, but it's an accident, versus something that happens because someone willfully intended to make this happen? We talk a little bit about emergency management structures. So things like incident command system, we touch on it, but we don't really go in deeply into it. We do have a course on incident command systems all the way from 100 to 400. And we did last week an introductory course on the 100 level, but we will eventually be giving those courses, and they will be accompanied by certificates for those people that complete the test. We cover emergency management cycle. We talk a lot more about dilemma management. We talk about organizational and personal challenges. What are the things that will happen to your organization in a crisis and to yourself? How do you respond to a crisis, and how can you deal with it? So that's what we cover in the 4-hour course. So, ladies and gentlemen, I know that was a lot of pressure to put on you, a lot of information that I threw at you. A lot of it is my thoughts, my experience. I hope you got something out of it. I think I kept it within the hour. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to address them. Thank you very much.
Great, Jeff. Thank you very much. I think that was extremely informative. I see there's a few comments in the group as well. You have been chatting. Ladies and gents, I'm going to unmute you. I have unmuted already. Please, if you have any questions or comments, please, now's the time to ask them. Dr. Jeff is still online. So I have unmuted you. If you'd like to chat, just raise your hand, or alternatively, you're welcome to chat if nobody else is. Any questions or comments, ladies and gents? None? If you would like to also put your question or comments in the chat box, that's great. Could you please share one lesson learned from Mohammed Wakas?
Where is the correction?
About?
Cease.
I'm sorry.
So we can't hear you. Can you repeat that? All right. So while you're getting your sound back, we've got two things.
There were so many lessons learned, Hawa, and that's the reason I'm asking in what context, because I've shared at least 10 lessons learned in this case. I think
Mr. Mohammed, if you can specify particularly in what area, that would be great. You're welcome to unmute yourself, or you're welcome to put it back into the chat. Mark Matthew, why the number of cases still increases even though there is a lockdown?
In some cases, the lockdown is ineffective. If you look at where are the numbers still increasing? Well, you look at the UK, it's pretty stable right now. It's not decreasing, but it's not increasing. In the US, it's still increasing. In Canada, it's more or less stable. In Austria, it's going down. In Sweden, it started increasing a little bit. In Germany, they started going up again. So Germany's saying, oh, wait a minute, we're back down. So why is it increasing again? For two reasons: lack of detection and lack of confinement, or people actually. The idea is when you come out of confinement, the idea is not to go back to what we did before, kissing everybody, shaking hands and everything. It's about being very careful, maintaining distance, wearing masks where needed. And when that's not done, then you see the cases go back up. Now, lessons learned about poor crisis management. You know what? If I had to give you one lesson learned overall, practice, practice, practice. If you don't exercise, if you don't train, if you don't anticipate these things, you will have poor emergency management ability. I many years ago, after the first avian flu pandemic, and after the Partipest, or the horse pest in South African horse pest in Europe, I did a lot of exercises and training with organizations in Canada and the Netherlands and elsewhere on pandemic preparation. What would happen? Where we considered the collapse of the infrastructure, social infrastructure. We had even anticipated that there would be no longer any collection of garbage in the big cities. It would accumulate, lead to more diseases. In 2010, I did an exercise on the terrorist-related pandemic. It was a pneumonic plague, very much like COVID-19, but it was actually introduced by terrorist organizations using airports and passengers, international passengers, as a vector. And in 2005 and in 2010, we did that. We were doing this a long time ago, and we're telling authorities this is something you need to prepare for. And they were saying at the time, "Gee, Jeff, your scenarios are a little bit far-fetched, aren't they?" Okay, interesting, but far-fetched. So the key is, look at the things that you're not expecting, practice for them, exercise with them, educate yourself, and then you'll be better prepared next time.
Perfect. There's a question from Ayodeji. I know that I've muted you for a moment, but I'm going to unmute you. But I believe the question is, how can you get the top management to be committed and possibly be part of the crisis management team?
I like that one. It's always been an issue. Well, you remind them of events like COVID-19, where you say, when that happens, it's going to be you on what we call the electric chair. So if you are not prepared for it, it's you that's going to look bad. I'm not covering for you. that I think you have to make it personal. You have to get senior management to understand that it's themselves who will be exposed to the scrutiny of the emergency management system and of the public and of the press if something were to happen. And you also have to remind them that unless they have some basic amount of training, they won't be able to respond properly. What I like to suggest is that you have a policy that says you train. If you have a job, you have to train. If you don't train, you don't do the job. And that policy can be signed by the minister when the minister thinks that it's not really that important. It won't affect me. And one day you turn around and say, look, a piece of paper that you signed, and this is, you have to train. So that's the only way you can do it. And also recognize, and this is important too, sometimes we have 4-day training courses, 5-day training courses, 2 weeks. You're not going to get a top manager for 2 weeks. Sorry. If you're lucky, you might get them for 2 hours, 4 hours. And again, it may not be 4 hours in a row, maybe an hour, 4 days in a row. So look at the training, providing training to senior managers in the way that's inventive and in the way that actually make them want to join the training. And maybe later on, they'll want to take the 4-hour training. So think of it that way.
Absolutely. Just a comment from Godard, who, thank you, Jeff. I would like to learn more regarding CBRN, so please provide me with everything a paramedic can learn. I'm sure you can't mention everything here, but perhaps maybe we'll put a mail together for you to see if there's anything specific to your requirements. Jeff, I don't know if you want to comment on that as well.
If he's a paramedic, so what we would also refer to as an emergency medical technician, that means you're the first one at the site. That is the case. You're on the front line. You're the frontline worker. 2 things. First of all, if you don't act as if when you get to the scene, you don't necessarily know it's CBRN. If you can't detect it, you can't respond to it. So the first thing for paramedic is be with people that can actually inform you on the presence of CBRN agents. Usually chemical or radiological. Biological, if you have, depending on the scene, for example, if it's an explosion, transport accident, you're unlikely to have the biological material there for the simple reason you're destroying the virus. But in the case of chemical and radiological, it is easy to detect. But if you don't have the equipment with you, then you're going to be responding in a way that will put yourselves at risk. And when you leave and you're contaminated, will put the rest of the staff at risk and your family possibly at risk. So you as an EMT, as a paramedic, need to know the very basics of what you need to do, basic CBRN awareness. We have a course on that. 4 hours needs to be basic, but you need to understand the very first thing. If you don't detect it, you don't know it's there, you don't respond to it. Nobody calls you and says, hey, we have a CBRN event now. They call you and say, we have an explosion, we have an accident, we have a truck accident, we have something like this, we have an explosion facility. You respond as if it was an explosion. If you don't know the CBRN agents, you can't respond for it.
Good. Fantastic. Ladies and gents, I don't see any more questions in the chat box. Quite a few wonderful comments. Thank you very much. Your lines are unmuted. If there's anyone who has a question, or if for some reason you are muted, please raise your hand, but we will be closing off now in the next minute. So if you have any questions, now's the time to ask. Also, please feel free to email us. You have our details based on the registration that you have registered with. Also, our team will be contacting you with more information about our upcoming workshops on CBRN. Please watch out for that, and please do register for them as you see them. We look forward to having you all shortly. Are there any questions just before I do my closing?
There's a small one about the best business continuity plan for COVID pandemic now. It's do you have another hour? Because I might take that long. No, the business recovery or continuity plan is it was actually implemented. If we talk about BCP, it's everything we've done, and the best thing we've done is we've done remote working. We've done teleworking. We have people working in different countries that have no stoppage at all of work. So the remote working is to me the best continuity planning, business continuity planning thing that was done. Why do we take the plane for 7 hours to go to a meeting that lasts an hour and a half? Don't see why. Crisis management plan we have here. Crisis plan, Okay, so that was on the business continuity planning.
Yes.
On the
Yeah.
next question is the
How can we enroll?
crisis management templates, crisis management plan. There are different models. Everybody uses different one. I can, it's difficult to share because often they are confidential, proprietary, and I can't give you a plan from Canada, the States, or Netherlands. But if you go on the internet, you'll find that there's a number of, do Google search, you'll find a number of them. The Americans tend to be quite open about their plans, especially the States. So you'll see what they have, but you're not going to find too much on pandemics.
Right. So there's also a question about how you can enroll for the crisis management course. Armel, if you can please put into the chat the contact telephone number with email address, and our team will definitely be able to get in touch with you. Mr. Mohammed Wakas, we do have your details, so we will also send you a mail with details of how you can actually register for the training programs. I believe there aren't any more questions. The last one is, I want to learn more about CBRN. Please send me more details. Absolutely, we will definitely do that through to you. Mr. or Mrs. Guest, I'm not sure who that is. It's showing up as a guest audience on my side. If you can please put your email address and telephone number, and the team who's in the background, Armel and Joanne, will definitely get in touch with you to give you more details on that. Ladies and gents, thank you very much. Jeff, firstly, from our side, on behalf of Orbrix, we'd really like to thank you for your time, your effort, and we really look forward to you running most of our other training programs coming up. We also have a few programs coming up in terms of ICS 100. As Jeff mentioned, we've got the 100 right up to 400, so please watch out for those. Inshallah, immediately after Ramadan, we'll start rolling out many more programs that you will have access to. So for those of you who's just joined us, thank you very much for your time, your effort, and we look forward to connecting with you. Jeff, parting words from your side. All the best from our side, and thank you very much for everything that you've done.
Thank you all, and great success and continuation of your professional activities.
Awesome. Thank you, ladies and gents. It's time that we will be signing off. If you have any questions, please mail us. And also, please feel free to fill out the evaluation form at the end of this program as you sign off. There is an evaluation. Please, your feedback will be highly appreciated. Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum. Goodbye, and until we see you again shortly.